the ancient sands of Mesopotamia, buried beneath millennia of silence, clay tablets waited. They waited for hands that would unearth them, for eyes that would decode them, for minds that would question everything they revealed. Among these artifacts, fragments scattered across museums and private collections worldwide, existed references to something scholars have long debated but rarely discussed openly: a set of guidelines, principles, perhaps even commandments given to humanity at the very dawn of civilization. Tonight, as the world quiets around you, we journey into this mystery together. We will examine what these ancient texts suggest, what historians have uncovered, and why one particular rule, the seventh, appears to have been deliberately obscured from the historical record. Somewhere beneath the ground you rest upon tonight, there exists a layer of earth that holds the memory of a time before memory itself, a stratum of dust and clay and forgotten intention, where the first cities rose from riverbank mud, where the first human hands pressed sharpened reeds into soft, wet tablets, where our ancestors first lifted their eyes toward the wheeling stars and wondered with a mixture of terror and longing whether something vast and unknowable might be gazing back at them from the darkness between those distant lights. This is where our journey begins tonight, not in the realm of speculation or fantasy, but in the tangible world of archaeological discovery, in the patient work of men and women who have spent lifetimes brushing sand from artifacts that have waited 5,000 years to speak again. Picture, if you will, the moment of unearthing, the soft scrape of a brush against hardened clay, the emergence of wedge-shaped marks that have not seen sunlight since the age of bronze, the weight of millennia pressing against your palm as you hold something that a Sumerian scribe once held, someone who lived and breathed and wondered about the universe just as you do now, someone who believed what they were writing was important enough to preserve for eternity. The tablets they left behind were not meant to be lost. They were libraries, archives, the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that rose and flourished and eventually crumbled back into the earth from which they had emerged. And yet the clay endured, fired by the very catastrophes that destroyed the cities, preserved by the dry desert air, waiting in darkness for hands that would not exist for thousands of years to find them and read them and wonder at what they contained. Tonight, we explore something that is rarely discussed in its entirety, a thread that runs through these ancient writings, a set of principles or rules that some researchers believe were given to humanity at the very dawn of civilization by beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. Whether you interpret these beings as gods in the mythological sense, as archetypal projections of human psychology, or as something else entirely, the rules themselves deserve our attention, for they represent what our earliest literate ancestors considered important enough to carve into permanence. And among these principles there is one, the seventh, that appears to have been deliberately hidden, obscured, erased from the record by unknown hands for unknown reasons, a gap in the ancient text that speaks as loudly as any word. We will come to that mystery in time. For now, let yourself settle into this journey. Let the concerns of the waking world grow distant. What we offer tonight is not a lecture, but an exploration, a wandering through landscapes both physical and mental, through time measured not in years, but in ages of human striving and wondering. Some of what we present represents scholarly consensus, the careful work of historians and linguists who have dedicated their lives to understanding these ancient peoples. Other elements represent interpretation, the connecting of threads that may or may not form a coherent pattern, ideas that invite contemplation rather than demand belief. All of it, we believe, is worthy of your attention on this quiet night, for the oldest stories may contain the deepest truths, and the questions our ancestors asked beneath those ancient stars are the same questions that stir within us still. The land where this story begins lies between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, a region the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, meaning simply the land between the waters. If you could hover above this landscape as an eagle might, drifting on warm currents of air rising from the fertile plains, you would see those two great rivers descending from mountain sources in the north, winding through increasingly flat terrain, approaching each other as they flow southward toward the Persian Gulf, creating between them a broad expanse of land that floods each spring with rich, dark silt carried down from distant highlands. This is the Fertile Crescent, the garden that would nurture the first seeds of human civilization, and it is no accident that so much of what we call history began here. The soil was impossibly rich, renewed each year by the river's overflow. The climate, though hot, was manageable for a species that had survived ice ages and learned to adapt to almost anything. The rivers provided not only water for drinking and irrigation, but highways for trade and communication, connecting communities that might otherwise have remained isolated in the vast flatness of the alluvial plain. It was here, in this fortunate geography, approximately 6,000 years ago, that human beings began to gather in numbers too large for the old tribal ways of living. Villages became towns. Towns became something unprecedented in the history of our species. They became cities. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, names that echoed down through millennia like bells struck in a distant temple. These were among the first true urban centers our species ever created, and their emergence around 4500 BCE marks the beginning of what we call Sumerian civilization. Consider the staggering antiquity of this. When the Sumerians were building their great temple platforms, their ziggurats rising like artificial mountains from the flat river plain, the pyramids of Egypt had not yet been conceived. Stonehenge was nothing but an empty hillside in a distant, foggy island that no Sumerian had ever heard of. The ancestors of the Greeks and Romans were scattered tribes who had not yet dreamed of the civilizations their descendants would create. More time separates us from ancient Rome than separated ancient Rome from ancient Sumer. We are closer in years to Julius Caesar than Julius Caesar was to the scribes who first pressed cuneiform into Mesopotamian clay. This is the depth of time into which we now descend, and it should fill us with a certain humility, for these were not primitive people fumbling in darkness. They were humans every bit as intelligent as ourselves, facing the same fundamental questions about existence, meaning, and the nature of the cosmos, and the answers they developed deserve our respectful attention. Among the many gifts the Sumerians gave to subsequent humanity, none perhaps surpasses the invention of writing itself. Cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge, describes the distinctive marks made when a cut reed is pressed into soft clay at an angle, leaving impressions that could be combined into hundreds of different signs, representing words, syllables, and concepts. The system began around 3400 BCE as a practical tool for accounting, for keeping track of grain stored in temple warehouses, of animals in royal herds, of goods traded between cities, the mundane bureaucratic necessities of complex society. But the human mind, once given a tool for recording thought, cannot resist expanding its use. Within a few centuries, cuneiform had evolved from simple accounting notation into a full writing system capable of preserving poetry and prayer, law and legend, the inner thoughts of individuals dead for 5 millennia. And here is the remarkable thing about clay tablets that those ancient scribes could never have anticipated. When their cities burned, when conquerors put temples to the torch and libraries collapsed in flame, the clay tablets were not destroyed. They were fired, hardened, made more permanent by the very catastrophes that ended the civilizations that created them. Tablets that might have crumbled to dust over centuries were instead baked into a permanence that has allowed us, in our distant age, to read the actual words of people who lived before the invention of the wheel. We can read the Sumerian creation myths. We can read their prayers to gods whose names had been forgotten for thousands of years. We can read letters between merchants discussing the price of copper, complaints from students about their teachers, lullabies sung to children who have been dust for 50 centuries. This is the miracle of Mesopotamian archaeology, this window into minds so distant and yet so recognizably human, and among all the writings preserved in this accidental library of clay, certain texts stand apart. Not the receipts for grain, not the lists of offerings brought to temples, not the instructions for brewing beer, which, yes, the Sumerians did write down, and which represent some of the oldest recipes in human history. No, the texts that concern us tonight are those that speak of origins, of creation, of beings that existed before humanity, and brought humanity into existence for purposes that the tablets attempt to explain. At the center of these creation stories, we find them, the figures known as the Anunnaki. The word Anunnaki has been translated in various ways by various scholars over the past century and a half of serious Mesopotamian studies. The most common interpretation renders it as something like those of royal blood or princely offspring, suggesting beings of divine lineage and authority. In the Sumerian cosmological system, the Anunnaki appear to represent the gods as a collective, particularly those associated with the earth and the underworld, as distinguished from the Igigi, who were associated with the heavens. Some texts present them as the children of the sky god Anu and the earth goddess Ki, their very name encoding their dual heritage as beings who bridge the celestial and terrestrial realms. But the term is not used consistently across all periods and all texts, and scholars continue to debate exactly which beings should be classified as Anunnaki and how their role in the Mesopotamian pantheon should be understood. What is clear is that these beings occupied a central place in Sumerian religious thought, and that their actions, their decisions, their conflicts with one another had direct and profound consequences for humanity. At the apex of the divine hierarchy stood Anu, the father of the gods, the ruler of heaven, distant and majestic, rarely intervening directly in the affairs of earth, but serving as the ultimate source of divine authority. Below him, exercising more immediate power over the world of mortals, were his children and their descendants. Enlil, god of wind and air and storms, often served as the chief executive of divine will, the one who issued commands and expected obedience, stern and demanding, quick to anger when humans failed to live up to his expectations. Enki, known in later Akkadian texts as Ea, was the god of fresh water, of wisdom, of craftsmanship, of magic and mischief, the cleverest of the gods, the one who most often advocated for humanity when the divine council grew frustrated with its creation. Inanna, later identified with the Akkadian Ishtar, was the goddess of love and war, and the morning star, passionate and dangerous, a force that could not be controlled or predicted. And beyond these principal figures stretched dozens of other deities, each with domain and character, temples and priesthoods, stories and attributes that the Sumerians elaborated over centuries of religious reflection. What makes the Anunnaki particularly interesting for our purposes tonight is the way the tablets describe them meeting in council, debating amongst themselves, reaching collective decisions about the fate of humanity. These were not omniscient beings acting in perfect unity according to some cosmic plan. They disagreed, they argued, they changed their minds, they regretted decisions they had made. They are portrayed with a psychological complexity that suggests the Sumerians understood their gods as personalities, as characters with consistent traits and histories, as beings whose choices mattered and whose relationships with one another shaped the world in which humans had to live. Now we must acknowledge that there exist multiple frameworks for interpreting who or what the Anunnaki actually were. The scholarly consensus, built on over a century of careful philological and archaeological work, treats them as mythological figures, comparable to the gods of other ancient pantheons, the Greek Olympians, the Norse Aesir, the Hindu Devas, divine personifications of natural forces and human aspirations that helped ancient peoples make sense of a universe they could not otherwise explain. In this reading, the Anunnaki were creations of human imagination, projections of power and authority and knowledge onto supernatural beings who served religious and social functions within Sumerian culture. This interpretation does not diminish the importance of studying them, for mythology reveals profound truths about the peoples who create it. But it does frame the texts as products of human creativity rather than records of actual events. There exists, however, an alternative interpretation that has gained considerable popular attention in recent decades, beginning primarily with the work of the researcher Zecharia Sitchin, who proposed that the Anunnaki were not mythological figures at all, but actual beings, perhaps visitors from elsewhere, whose interactions with early humans were recorded in the tablets not as fiction, but as history filtered through the conceptual limitations of ancient observers. According to this view, the creation stories describe actual interventions in human development, and the rules and instructions attributed to the gods were literal guidelines given to humanity by beings of superior knowledge and capability. We present both frameworks tonight, not to advocate for one over the other, but because the rules themselves, whatever their ultimate origin, deserve examination. If the Anunnaki were purely mythological, then the principles attributed to them represent the distilled wisdom of Sumerian civilization, what those ancient peoples believed was most important for human flourishing. And such wisdom merits our attention. If the alternative interpretation holds any truth, then we are examining something even more remarkable: actual instructions from beings whose knowledge exceeded our ancestors' ability to fully comprehend. Either way, the rules matter. Either way, our ancestors carved them into clay because they believed the principles contained within were essential for humanity to understand and follow. Either way, we are justified in asking what those principles were and what happened to the seventh one that appears to have been deliberately hidden. The great creation texts of Mesopotamia offer us detailed accounts of how the gods brought forth the world and, eventually, humanity itself. The Enuma Elish, composed in its surviving form around 1100 BCE, but drawing on much older Sumerian sources, describes a cosmic drama of staggering scope. In the beginning, there were only the mingled waters, Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt sea, and from their union emerged the first generation of gods. But these younger gods were noisy and disturbing, and Apsu wished to destroy them, setting in motion a chain of conflict that would culminate in cosmic battle. The young god Marduk, champion of the divine assembly, faced Tiamat in combat and split her body to create the heavens and the earth, establishing order from primordial chaos. This is cosmogony as drama, creation as consequence of conflict, and it established the pattern of Mesopotamian thought, wherein the world we inhabit emerged from struggle and continues to exist only through the ongoing effort to maintain order against the ever-present threat of chaos. But it is the Atrahasis epic that speaks most directly to the creation of humanity, and its account is both fascinating and slightly troubling to modern sensibilities. According to this text, the lesser gods had been burdened with the labor of maintaining the world, digging the channels that irrigated the land, performing the endless work that kept the cosmos functioning. They grew weary and resentful. They rebelled. And in response to this divine labor crisis, Enki proposed a solution. Humanity would be created to bear the burden that the gods no longer wished to carry. The mother goddess Nintu, also known as Ninhursag or Mami, would shape this new being from clay mixed with the flesh and blood of a slaughtered god, a divine sacrifice whose essence would animate the earthen form and give humanity its spark of intelligence and awareness. This is not creation as gift, but creation as solution to a problem, not humanity made in the image of divine love, but humanity made as a workforce to serve divine needs. And yet, within this seemingly cold account, there are hints of something more. The god whose blood was used in the creation, Geshtu-e, was described as a god of intelligence, and his essence passing into humanity suggests that we were intended from the beginning to be thinking, understanding, aware beings, not mere automatons, but creatures capable of comprehending the cosmos in which we found ourselves. And if we were created with purpose, if we were brought into existence to fulfill a role in the divine order, then surely we were also given instructions, guidelines for how to fulfill that role properly, principles for how to live in right relationship with the gods who made us and the world we were made to tend. The Sumerian concept of the Me, sometimes translated as divine decrees or cosmic powers, suggests exactly this. The Me were fundamental principles or forces that governed every aspect of civilization, from kingship and priesthood to the arts of writing and music, from the proper conduct of war to the proper performance of sacred rituals. They were said to be held originally by the gods and then bestowed upon humanity as gifts that made civilized life possible. The myth of Inanna and Enki describes the goddess visiting Enki in his watery domain, and, through a combination of cunning and intoxication, persuading him to give her the Me, which she then brought to her city of Uruk, establishing it as a center of culture and power. The exact number and nature of the Me varied in different texts. But the concept itself suggests that the Sumerians understood their civilization as operating according to principles that had been handed down from a higher source. Rules for existence, guidelines for living, instructions from those who came before. Scattered across multiple tablets from multiple sites spanning multiple centuries, researchers have identified references to what some believe forms a coherent system, 12 fundamental principles that the Anunnaki were said to have established for humanity. Not all scholars accept this interpretation. The texts are fragmentary, the translations sometimes uncertain. The temptation to see patterns where none exist is ever present when dealing with incomplete evidence. But the themes that emerge from careful study of these sources are remarkably consistent, and they speak to concerns that remain relevant 5,000 years after they were first inscribed. Tonight, we will examine these 12 rules as they have been reconstructed from the available evidence. We will consider what each might mean for the ancient Sumerians and what each might offer to us in our distant age. And we will pay particular attention to the 7th rule, for it is here that the trail grows strange, the texts grow fragmentary, and the suspicion arises that something has been deliberately concealed from the record. Let us pause here for a moment in our journey and take stock of where we have come. We have established the world in which our story unfolds, that ancient landscape between two rivers, where humanity first gathered in cities and first set down in permanent form its thoughts and beliefs and dreams. We have met the central figures of Sumerian cosmology, the Anunnaki, beings of power and complexity who debated in divine council and made decisions that shaped human destiny. We have seen how humanity was created according to these ancient texts, formed from clay and divine essence for purposes that the gods determined. And we have introduced the concept of divine rules, principles handed down from the gods to guide human existence, the framework we will now explore in detail. The 12 rules, as we will present them, represent one interpretation of scattered textual evidence, a synthesis that not all scholars would endorse, but which reveals consistent themes worth contemplating. We present them not as certain truth, but as a lens through which to view ancient wisdom, knowing that the act of interpretation always involves a degree of creative reconstruction. The first 6 rules, we will find, establish foundations for physical and social existence. The 7th, the hidden rule, appears to occupy a pivotal position, perhaps bridging the practical and the spiritual, perhaps revealing something the keepers of these texts did not wish widely known. The final 5 rules seem to address higher concerns, wisdom and justice, and the ultimate trajectory of human destiny. This is the structure we will follow as the night continues and the mystery deepens. Let yourself sink further into this exploration. The darkness around you is the same darkness that surrounded ancient temples, ancient libraries, ancient scribes working by lamplight to preserve what they believed mattered most. Whether these were divine commands or human wisdom dressed in divine clothing, they represent what our earliest civilized ancestors thought important enough to carve into eternity. Together now, let us read what they inscribed and discover what they chose to hide. And so we arrive at the heart of our journey tonight, the 12 principles that some researchers believe the Anunnaki inscribed into the foundations of human civilization. And we begin with what may be the most fundamental instruction of all, the first rule, which appears across numerous tablets in various forms, but always carries the same essential meaning. Remember from whence you came? Know your origin. Never forget the source of your existence. And this principle echoes through the hymns dedicated to Enki, the wise one, the lord of the sweet waters who participated in humanity's creation, where we find passages that call upon humanity to remember their fashioning, to hold in their hearts the moment when clay and divine essence merged to create something new, something capable of thought and wonder and worship. And the temples themselves served as architectural reminders of this first rule, their very structures designed to orient the worshipper toward the heavens, toward the realm from which the gods descended, toward the source of all being. And the rituals performed within these sacred spaces often reenacted the creation itself, with priests taking the roles of Enki and the birth goddess Ninhursag, mixing symbolic clay with symbolic divine essence, reminding every witness that they were not accidents of nature, but intentional creations with purpose and meaning. And when we consider this rule through multiple interpretive lenses, we discover layers of wisdom that speak across the millennia. For the religious reading tells us to remember that we are creation rather than creator, to maintain humility before forces greater than ourselves, while the philosophical reading urges us to know our history so that we might know ourselves. For how can anyone understand where they are going if they have forgotten where they came from? And the alternative interpretation, favored by those who see in these texts something more than mythology, suggests this was a literal instruction to remember actual events, to pass down through generations the memory of contact with beings who shaped human destiny. And perhaps most intriguing is the psychological reading, which recognizes that identity itself is rooted in understanding one's source, that the fundamental human question of who am I can only be answered by first addressing the question of where did I come from. And is it not remarkable that this ancient instruction continues to pulse through human behavior today? That origin stories persist across every culture on Earth, that the question of where do I come from drives millions to trace their genealogies, to submit their DNA for testing, to search archives and interview elderly relatives, all in pursuit of that primal knowledge the first rule commands us to seek. And so the ancients understood something we are only now rediscovering, that to be human is to need a story about one's beginning, a narrative that connects the self to something larger and older and more enduring than any individual life. The second rule builds upon this foundation of remembered origin and extends it into the realm of relationship and structure. For the tablets speak of respecting the order of heaven and earth, honoring the hierarchy that exists not merely as social convention, but as cosmic principle woven into the fabric of existence itself. And this concept was expressed through the Sumerian word Mee, those divine decrees that governed everything from kingship to the crafting of beer, from the descent of the soul after death to the proper way of tending sheep. And the Me were not arbitrary rules invented by human authorities, but were understood to be the very operating instructions of reality, gifts from the gods that made civilization possible. And we see this principle reflected in the great king lists that trace royal authority back through time to the gods themselves, establishing an unbroken chain of legitimacy from heaven to the throne. And the temple hierarchies mirrored this cosmic structure, with each priest and priestess occupying a place that corresponded to celestial arrangements, and the rituals reinforced these relationships constantly, positioning human beings within a vast web of connection that extended from the lowest servant to the highest deity. And we may examine this rule through different interpretive frameworks, noting how some scholars see here a tool of social control, a way for those in power to justify their positions by claiming divine sanction. Yet others perceive something more profound, and recognition that humanity occupies a specific place within a grand design. Neither masters of the universe nor insignificant specks, but participants in a structured cosmos where every being has a role. And the practical interpretation reminds us that every functional society requires some form of organization, some way of coordinating the actions of many individuals toward common purposes. And the alternative reading suggests these were instructions for how human beings should relate to the Anunnaki themselves, protocols for interaction with beings whose power and knowledge far exceeded humanity's own. And this rule may feel uncomfortable to modern sensibilities, raised on ideals of equality and individual autonomy. Yet we might pause to consider that even our contemporary world operates through countless hierarchies, from the organization of workplaces to the structure of governments to the implicit rankings we create in every social group. And perhaps the wisdom here lies not in the specific hierarchies the ancients honored, but in the recognition that structure itself is necessary for harmony, that chaos serves no one, that the question is not whether hierarchy exists, but what kind of hierarchy serves life and flourishing. The third rule penetrates even deeper into the nature of human existence as the ancients understood it, for here we encounter an instruction that strikes at the very purpose for which humanity was created. And the tablets are remarkably direct on this point, stating that work is the sacred duty for which you were fashioned, that labor is not a curse but a calling, not a punishment, but a participation in the ongoing maintenance of cosmic order. And this principle is woven throughout the creation narratives, particularly the Atrahasis epic, where we learn that the gods themselves once labored, digging the canals that brought water to the land, tilling the soil, performing the endless tasks that sustained existence, until they grew weary and in their weariness conceived of creating beings who would take up this burden, and so humanity was formed, mixed from clay and the blood of a sacrificed god, specifically designed to work, to tend, to build, to maintain. And the hymns of ancient Sumer praise the craftsman and the farmer with the same reverence accorded to priest and king, celebrating the skill of the potter at her wheel, the patience of the shepherd with his flock, the strength of the laborer in the field. And these were not mere occupations, but forms of worship, ways of fulfilling humanity's divine purpose. And when we examine this rule through various interpretive lenses, we find both shadow and light. For certainly this principle could be and likely was used to extract labor from workers by framing their toil as sacred duty. Yet there exists within this teaching a profound dignity as well, an insistence that no honest work is beneath consideration, that every form of productive effort connects the worker to forces greater than themselves. And the economic interpretation notes that any society dependent on agriculture and irrigation required immense coordinated labor, and perhaps framing this necessity as sacred made the burden easier to bear, gave meaning to tasks that might otherwise crush the spirit with their monotony. And we cannot help but notice a strange paradox in our modern world, for we have achieved what the ancients could scarcely imagine: freedom from much physical labor through machines and systems that work while we rest. And yet, alongside this liberation has come an epidemic of meaninglessness, a sense that something vital was lost when work became mere employment rather than sacred participation. And so we might ask what the ancients understood that we have forgotten. What wisdom they encoded in this third rule that we dismissed as primitive, only to discover we needed it all along. For perhaps purpose is not found in freedom from labor, but in labor itself, when that labor is understood as contribution to something greater than the self. The fourth rule carries us from the realm of human effort into the living world that sustains it. For here, the tablets instruct humanity to care for the earth that gives you life, to tend the garden, to serve as stewards rather than owners of the land. And this principle emerges naturally from the Mesopotamian experience, for the people of Sumer knew in their bones that their civilization depended entirely upon the delicate relationship between water and soil, that the Tigris and Euphrates could give life through irrigation or take it through flood, that the earth itself required constant attention if it was to yield its fruits. And so care for the land became not merely practical advice, but sacred command. And we find descriptions of Dilmun, the paradise garden of the gods, a place of pure water and abundant growth, presented as both the origin of creation and the model for human aspiration. And Enki, the lord of fresh water, appears throughout the tablets as the deity most concerned with fertility and growth, teaching humanity the secrets of irrigation, blessing the fields and orchards, ensuring that the sweet waters rose from beneath the earth to nourish all living things. And the temple gardens themselves served as demonstrations of this principle, carefully tended sacred spaces where plants and trees and flowers grew in harmonious arrangement, living symbols of what the entire earth could become under proper care. And we may consider this rule through the ecological lens and recognize what sounds remarkably like ancient environmentalism, an understanding that humanity depends upon nature and must therefore protect it, or through the spiritual lens that sees in nature itself a manifestation of divine presence, so that caring for the earth becomes a form of caring for the gods, or through the alternative interpretation that suggests humanity was maintaining the garden not merely for themselves, but for the Anunnaki, keeping the planet in proper condition for those who would return. And whatever lens we choose, the urgent modern echo remains. For we who have exploited and polluted and destabilized the very systems that sustain us, now hear in this ancient rule a rebuke and a remedy, a reminder that our ancestors knew something we chose to forget, that the earth is not an infinite resource to be consumed, but a garden to be tended, and the choice between stewardship and exploitation was presented to humanity thousands of years ago. And we chose, and we continue to choose, and the fourth rule waits patiently for us to finally listen. The fifth rule concerns the continuation of existence itself. For here, humanity is instructed to be fruitful and multiply, to continue the line, to ensure that the gift of life passes from generation to generation in unbroken succession. And this principle finds expression throughout Mesopotamian religion in the veneration of fertility, in the great goddess Inanna, who presided over love and sexuality and the sacred mystery of reproduction, in the rituals that ensured the fertility not only of human beings, but of animals and crops as well, in the ancestral practices that honored those who came before and thus made present existence possible. And the interpretation layers here reveal multiple dimensions of meaning. for the biological reading recognizes survival of the species as the most fundamental imperative of all living things, written into our very cells, while the cultural reading sees the continuation of civilization itself, the passing of knowledge and custom and identity from parents to children across the ages. And the spiritual reading perceives in reproduction a participation in creation itself, a mirroring of what the gods did when they fashioned the first humans. For when we bring new life into the world, we take on something of the divine creative power. And the alternative reading, more pragmatic and perhaps more troubling, suggests that this was an instruction to maintain the population of workers, to ensure that there would always be humans to perform the labors for which they were created. And we may note that nearly every ancient culture on Earth contains some version of this instruction, that the commandment to be fruitful appears in Genesis with wording so similar to these older Mesopotamian texts that the connection cannot be coincidental. And when a rule appears across all cultures and all ages, we must ask what this universality reveals, whether it points to common human psychology or to a common source far older than any single tradition. The sixth rule brings us to the threshold of mystery, for here the tablets speak of sacrifice and offering, of giving back to those who gave you life. And this principle of reciprocity runs through the entire Mesopotamian religious system, expressed in the endless offerings brought to the temples, the first fruits of harvest, the finest animals of the flock, the beer and bread and oil that nourished the statues of the gods. And the modern mind may struggle to understand this practice, may see only superstition or exploitation by a priestly class. Yet the deeper meaning revealed something profound about the ancient understanding of existence. For they perceived reality as a web of relationships requiring constant maintenance, a cosmic economy in which gifts must flow in all directions to maintain harmony. And the gods had given humanity life and land and the knowledge to survive. And in return, humanity offered back a portion of what the earth produced, not because the gods needed sustenance, but because the relationship itself needed affirmation. And the prayers that accompanied these offerings reveal their true purpose, expressing gratitude, acknowledging dependence, renewing the bond between creation and creator, and through different interpretive lenses. We may see transaction or thanksgiving, manipulation or genuine spiritual exchange. And the alternative reading proposes that these offerings were literal provisions for beings who actually consumed them, that the feeding of the statues was not symbolic but practical. And whatever interpretation we favor, we have now examined 6 rules, 6 foundations for human existence. Know your origin, honor the hierarchy, labor with purpose, tend the garden, continue the line, give back to those who gave you life. And a pattern emerges in this sequence, a coherent system for living that addresses humanity's relationship to the past through remembering origin, to society through respecting order, to daily existence through meaningful work, to nature through careful stewardship, to the future through reproduction, and to the divine through sacrifice. And we should expect the 7th rule to complete this foundation, to perhaps summarize these teachings or elevate them to a higher synthesis. And yet, when scholars examined the textual evidence for what should be the 7th principle, they encountered something they did not anticipate, something that raises questions far more troubling than any answers we have found so far. For where the 7th rule should appear, they found gaps and erasures and damage, passages that seem to have been deliberately obscured. And we must now ask, what was Rule 7, And why did someone, whether human or otherwise, want it hidden from us? The mystery of the seventh rule deepens the more closely we examine it. For across multiple tablets from different cities spanning different centuries, we find the same curious phenomenon. The text proceeds through the first 6 principles with clarity and consistency, and then precisely where we would expect the 7th teaching to appear. The clay is damaged, the signs are scraped away, the passage becomes illegible, and while any single instance might be attributed to the accidents of time and the fragility of ancient materials, the pattern repeats too consistently to dismiss. Too many tablets from too many sources showing damage at exactly the same point, and what fragments survive only deepen the mystery. Partial phrases that seem to hint at something extraordinary, references to the true nature of something left unspecified, warnings that certain knowledge must not be revealed, mentions of what the gods know that humanity does not, cautions about what might happen should this information spread, and we can consider multiple explanations for this phenomenon. For conventional scholarship suggests natural causes, noting that tablets often broke along similar lines due to how they were stored or transported, or pointing to scribal discretion regarding esoteric knowledge not meant for public circulation, or simply acknowledging that texts do get lost and not everything survives the millennia. And yet, alternative researchers propose more provocative possibilities, suggesting that later priestly classes deliberately erased teachings they found threatening, that knowledge deemed too dangerous for common humanity was systematically destroyed, that instructions for direct contact with the Anunnaki were suppressed by those who wished to maintain their role as intermediaries, that power was withheld from humanity by those who feared what we might become if we possessed it. And when we examine possible reconstructions of what the 7th rule might have contained, we find several compelling theories. The first proposing that it revealed humanity's divine essence, that we are not mere creations, but contain within us a spark of the gods themselves, which would challenge the hierarchy established in the 2nd rule and elevate human status to something approaching divine, a dangerous teaching for those who wish to keep humanity humble and obedient. And the 2nd theory suggests the rule contained instructions for summoning and binding the gods, ritual knowledge that would reverse the relationship between humanity and the Anunnaki, giving humans power over the very beings who created them, information that any authority structure would want to suppress. And the 3rd theory proposes that the hidden teaching concerned consciousness after death, secrets about the afterlife that contradicted official doctrine, perhaps revealing that individual immortality was possible in ways the priestly class denied, threatening their role as guides to the shadowy netherworld they described. And the 4th theory is perhaps most intriguing, suggesting that Rule 7 contained instructions for preparing for the return of the Anunnaki, protocols and preparations for when the gods would come back to Earth, teachings that might have been suppressed when that return failed to occur as expected, or suppressed by those who feared what that return might bring. And we may picture the scene: a scribe in ancient Nippur with reed stylus pressing into wet clay, inscribing the first 6 principles faithfully as he was taught, and now coming to the 7th. And what happens next? Does a supervisor appear and take the tablet away to some inner sanctum? Does the scribe himself carefully erase what he has written while glancing over his shoulder? Or is it much later, centuries later, when a priest of a different era recognizes what these old tablets contain and methodically destroys this section wherever he finds it, and we cannot know for certain, the tablets are silent precisely where they should speak loudest. And in that silence we are left to wonder what the ancients knew that someone wanted forgotten. Why the number 7 would be chosen for this most protected teaching. For 7 was sacred across the ancient world. 7 classical planets visible to the naked eye. 7 days in the week we still observe. 7 sages who brought civilization to humanity in Mesopotamian legend. 7 gates through which the soul descended to the underworld. The 7th position holding special numerological weight, precisely what you would want to control if you were going to hide something. And perhaps we must make peace with the mystery, acknowledging that we may never know with certainty what the 7th rule contained, yet recognizing that the absence itself speaks, that the gap in the text is itself a kind of message. For if there was nothing important in the 7th position, then why the consistent damage? Why the careful erasure? Why the silence where speech should be? And what we are left with is an invitation to wonder, to contemplate what could be so significant that it needed to be hidden. What knowledge about human nature, or divine nature, or the relationship between them was deemed too dangerous to preserve? And perhaps the hidden rule is hidden because it must be discovered rather than given. Perhaps each person must find their own 7th principle in the space where the ancient text goes dark. The remaining rules carry us upward from the mystery of the 7th into what we might call the higher teachings, principles that build upon the foundation of the first 6 and point toward humanity's ultimate purpose and destiny. And the 8th rule calls us to seek wisdom above all else, to make the pursuit of understanding our sacred duty. And this principle finds its divine expression in Enki, the Lord of Wisdom, who loved humanity enough to save us from destruction, who gave us the arts of civilization, who fashioned us with minds capable of learning and growing and comprehending ever more of the vast cosmos around us. And the temples of ancient Mesopotamia were not merely places of worship, but centers of learning, housing libraries of tablets and schools where scribes spent years mastering the complex arts of writing and calculation and observation, and knowledge itself was understood as a path toward the divine. Each truth discovered, bringing humanity closer to the gods who understood all things. And the 9th rule extends this wisdom into the realm of human relationships, commanding that we maintain justice among ourselves. And we see this principle monumentalized in the famous Code of Hammurabi, that pillar of stone inscribed with laws covering everything from property rights to professional conduct, though the principle is far older than that famous king, woven throughout Mesopotamian culture in the understanding that the gods watched human behavior and judged it according to standards of fairness and equity. And justice was not merely social convenience, but cosmic principle. And kings were understood as divine agents responsible for ensuring that the scales remained balanced, that the strong did not devour the weak, that wrongs were righted and harmony maintained. And the 10th rule directs human attention to the heavens themselves, instructing us to honor the cycles, the great rhythms of sun and moon and season that govern all earthly existence. And the Mesopotamians were extraordinary astronomers, tracking the movements of celestial bodies with remarkable precision, developing calendars and predicting eclipses, understanding that human life must align with cosmic patterns if it is to flourish. And their festivals mark the turning points of the year, the solstices and equinoxes, the rising and setting of significant stars, weaving human celebration into the fabric of celestial time. And the 11th rule turns our gaze toward our own mortality, bidding us prepare for the great accounting that awaits every soul. For the Mesopotamians believed that after death, each person would face judgment, their deeds weighed and evaluated, their treatment in the afterlife determined by how they had lived, a concept that would later find expression in Egyptian religion and eventually in the traditions that shaped Western civilization. And this awareness of mortality was not meant to terrify, but to guide, encouraging humans to live in ways that would bear scrutiny when the final reckoning came. And the 12th and final rule brings us to the edge of time itself, for here humanity is instructed to look to the heavens and await instruction, to remember that the story is not complete, that the Anunnaki who created us and taught us and gave us these principles will return. And when they do, humanity must be ready, must have maintained the teachings, preserved the knowledge, tended the garden and honored the cycles, and sought the wisdom, so that when the gods descend once more, they will find their creation worthy. And this final rule frames all the others within a narrative of anticipation, suggesting that human history moves toward a destination, that our efforts and struggles and achievements are preparation for something yet to come. And whether we understand this literally or metaphorically, or refuse to understand it at all, the power of the image remains. 12 rules cascading from ancient tablets, 1 hidden in mystery, 11 preserved for those with eyes to read and ears to hear. A complete system for human existence given at the dawn of civilization and waiting still to be fully understood and finally followed. And so we arrive at the place where all the threads come together, where the 12 rules reveal themselves not as scattered fragments, but as a single unified vision of human existence, a complete architecture for living that our ancestors carved into clay 5,000 years ago, and which has echoed through every civilization since. Let us now step back and see the pattern whole. For when we view these principles together, something remarkable emerges. A sophistication of thought that should humble anyone who believes wisdom began with the modern age. The first 6 rules form the physical foundation of human life, the bedrock upon which everything else must be built. Rule 1 tells us to know our origin, to remember from whence we came, to never lose sight of the source from which humanity sprang. Whether you understand that source as divine creation, cosmic accident, or something stranger still. Rule 2 establishes the order of existence, the hierarchy that connects heaven to earth, gods to humans, humans to animals, and all things to the great cosmic structure that holds reality together. Rule 3 sanctifies labor, transforming the burden of work into sacred participation in the maintenance of the world itself, teaching that through our efforts, we join in the endless task of sustaining creation. Rule 4 commands us to tend the garden, to care for the earth that feeds us, to understand ourselves not as owners of this world, but as gardeners entrusted with its flourishing. Rule 5 ensures continuation, the instruction to procreate and multiply, to pass the torch of consciousness from generation to generation, so that humanity persists through the long ages. Rule 6 closes the physical foundation with sacrifice and offering, the recognition that we must give back to that which gave us life, maintaining the reciprocal relationship between humanity and the powers that sustain us. These 6 rules together create a complete system for physical existence, for surviving and thriving in the material world, for building civilizations that endure. Then we encounter the gap, the mystery, Rule 7, the hidden principle that should bridge the physical and spiritual dimensions of the system. We have examined the damaged tablets, the deliberate erasures, the theories about what this rule might have contained, and we have acknowledged that certainty eludes us. Perhaps it spoke of humanity containing divine essence. Perhaps it revealed techniques for contacting the gods directly. Perhaps it disclosed secrets about what happens to consciousness after death. Or perhaps it contained instructions for preparing for the return of the Anunnaki themselves. The seventh rule remains hidden, and that hiddenness is itself significant, a gap in the pattern that speaks as loudly as any inscription. Beyond this mystery, the final 5 rules lift us from physical survival into spiritual elevation. Rule 8 commands the pursuit of wisdom above all things, making the search for understanding itself a sacred duty. Rule 9 establishes justice among humanity, teaching that our treatment of one another matters to the cosmic order. Rule 10 honors the cycles of sun and moon and season, aligning human life with the great rhythms that pulse through the universe. Rule 11 prepares us for the great accounting, the weighing of deeds that awaits each soul, ensuring we live with awareness of mortality and consequence. And Rule 12, the final instruction, tells us to look to the heavens and await further guidance, keeping humanity oriented toward the sky from which the gods descended and to which our hopes ascend. When we see this complete system, we must ask ourselves what it suggests about the people who created it, or about the beings who gave it to them, if we entertain that possibility. This is not a primitive scratching toward meaning. This is a comprehensive philosophy of human existence, addressing our need for identity, our place in the cosmic order, the sanctification of our labor, our relationship with the natural world, our biological continuation, our reciprocal relationship with the divine, our pursuit of wisdom, our treatment of one another, our alignment with cosmic cycles, our preparation for death, and our orientation toward the future. How many modern philosophies achieve such completeness? How many contemporary systems of thought address all these dimensions of human experience with such elegant integration? We are not wiser than our ancestors. We are differently wise, or perhaps we have merely forgotten what they knew and called our forgetting progress. The persistent questions remain, humming beneath the surface of everything we have explored tonight. Why do these principles resonate across 5,000 years, still recognizable, still relevant, still challenging us to live according to their wisdom? Why do we find echoes of these rules in every subsequent civilization, in the laws of Hammurabi, in the teachings of Moses, in the philosophies of Greece, in the ethics of every major religious tradition? Did all these cultures independently arrive at similar conclusions because these principles reflect genuine truths about human existence? Or did the original instructions given in ancient Sumer ripple outward through time and space, adapting to new languages and new cultures while preserving their essential core? And what did the ancients experience that we have forgotten? What did they see, hear, and know that made them so certain of the reality of the Anunnaki, so devoted to following these divine rules, so committed to preserving these teachings for future generations? Was the seventh rule hidden to protect us from knowledge we were not ready to receive? Is it still hidden for that reason, Or is it waiting to be discovered? Its time not yet come. Its revelation reserved for those who have sufficiently prepared themselves through following the other 11. These questions have no final answers, and perhaps that is how it should be, for certainty would close the door that wonder holds open. Now let us consider how these ancient rules live on in our modern world, often without our recognition of their source. Look around you at the ways people search for meaning in their lives, at the hunger for purpose that no amount of material comfort seems to satisfy, at the growing awareness that we must change our relationship with the natural world or face catastrophic consequences. These are not new concerns. These are the concerns the ancients addressed in their 12 rules, still active in modern hearts, still shaping human behavior, still demanding our attention. When someone feels compelled to research their family history, to trace their ancestry back through generations, they are following Rule 1, seeking to know their origin. When people speak of finding their place in the world, of understanding where they fit in the grand scheme of things, they are responding to Rule 2, searching for their position in the order of existence. When meaningful work brings satisfaction that mere entertainment cannot match, when people discover that contributing something valuable brings deeper fulfillment than passive consumption, they are experiencing Rule 3, the sanctification of labor. When environmental consciousness awakens and people commit to protecting forests and oceans and the climate itself, they are answering Rule 4, tending the garden. When parents look at their children and feel connected to something larger than their individual lives, when they understand themselves as links in a chain stretching back through countless generations and forward into futures they will never see, they are living Rule 5, ensuring continuation. When gratitude arises spontaneously for the gifts of existence, when people feel moved to give back to their communities or to express appreciation to whatever they understand as the source of their blessings, they are practicing Rule 6, the way of sacrifice and offering. The rules beyond the hidden 7th likewise persist. The hunger for knowledge that drives scientists and scholars and curious minds everywhere reflects Rule 8. The passion for justice that leads people to protest, oppression, and demand fairness embodies Rule 9. The growing interest in living according to natural rhythms, in paying attention to seasons and cycles, rather than treating time as empty container to be filled with productivity, honors Rule 10. The awareness that our actions matter, that how we live has consequences beyond our individual lives, responds to Rule 11. And the persistent human tendency to look upward, to wonder about what exists beyond our world, to search the stars for signs of other intelligence, continues Rule 12 in modern form. What we call intuition may be ancient memory. What we experience as conscience may be these rules still operating within us, inscribed not in clay, but in consciousness itself, passed down not through texts, but through the very structure of what it means to be human. The 7th rule deserves special consideration as we contemplate these modern implications, for perhaps it is hidden not as conspiracy, but as invitation. Perhaps some truths cannot be given directly, but must be discovered through personal effort. Perhaps the gap in the tablets is not damage, but design, a space left empty so that each person who encounters it might fill it with their own revelation. The hidden rule might be different for each of us, personalized instruction that emerges only when we have sufficiently understood and practiced the other 11. Or perhaps the 7th rule is the same for everyone, but can only be grasped when the seeker is ready, when they have prepared the ground through following the foundational principles and opened their minds through pursuing the higher teachings. In this understanding, the hidden rule is less a secret kept from us and more a gift waiting to be received, a treasure that must be earned rather than simply handed over. You do not need to believe the Anunnaki were literal beings who descended from the sky and created humanity through advanced technology. You do not need to believe they were gods in the supernatural sense. You do not need to believe anything at all to find value in what we have explored tonight. Myth carries truth regardless of literal history. The rules work whether the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors, divine beings, psychological projections of early human consciousness, or simply the way ancient peoples personified the forces of nature and society that shape their lives. The wisdom is the treasure. The origin is merely the wrapping. Take what serves you from this night of exploration. Leave what does not serve. Trust your own capacity to discern what resonates and what does not. You are heir to the same consciousness that crafted these rules 5,000 years ago, and that consciousness knows its own needs. And so we return to the dust and the silence, to the place where we began, to the clay tablets still waiting in museum drawers and archaeological sites and private collections around the world. We have walked among ancient words tonight, traced the outlines of a forgotten wisdom, and encountered a mystery that remains unresolved. This is as it should be. Certainty would cheapen what we have experienced together. The value lies not in arriving at final answers, but in engaging with questions that have occupied human minds since the first cities rose from the mud of Mesopotamia. If you have stayed with us through this entire journey, we thank you for your attention and your willingness to contemplate these ancient things. If you are drifting towards sleep, carry these thoughts into your dreams as companions for the night ahead. The Mesopotamians believed that dreams were messages, communications from the divine realm that could guide and instruct the dreamer. Perhaps tonight, as you rest, you will receive your own seventh rule, the hidden principle emerging from the depths of your own consciousness, to complete the pattern that the ancients began. Picture, if you will, the god Enki, the water lord, the wise one, the friend of humanity who advocated for our existence when other gods grew frustrated with their creation. Imagine him looking across the span of 5,000 years, across the rise and fall of empires, across the birth and death of countless generations, to see you in this moment, to hear you wondering about the things that he knew. Perhaps he smiles. Perhaps he is pleased that the questions persist, that curiosity endures, that human beings still look at the ancient tablets and ask what they mean. Perhaps the questions were always the answer, the seeking itself the fulfillment of the highest rule. The tablets will wait for those who seek them, patient as only clay can be, holding their secrets for anyone willing to learn the old languages and trace the wedge-shaped marks that our ancestors pressed into wet earth so long ago. The stars above you tonight are the same stars that the Sumerians watched from their ziggurats, the same lights that they associated with the Anunnaki, the same eternal witnesses that have observed every moment of human history. You are connected to those ancient stargazers through the unbroken chain of human consciousness, through the rules that still live in your heart, even if you never knew their origin. Rest now with ancient wisdom for company. Let the mystery of the seventh rule settle into your mind like sediment drifting to the riverbed. There is no urgency, no deadline for understanding. The tablets waited 5,000 years before we began to read them again, and they will wait as long as necessary for their meanings to unfold. Whatever Rule 7 contained, whatever knowledge the ancients hid or protected or reserved for those who were ready, may you discover it for yourself, in your own time, through your own seeking. The night deepens around you. The ancient voices fade to whispers, then to silence. Sleep comes like water rising slowly, carrying you into depths where dreams wait with their strange and beautiful truths. And if you dream tonight of ancient places, of reed styluses pressing into wet clay, of star gods looking down with knowing eyes, remember that you are not merely dreaming of the past, you are remembering.